Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it is no secret that the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, agrees with MPs on the Defence Select Committee, who today called for far more to be spent on the armed forces. Right now, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liz Truss, is on her feet, strongly disagreeing with him in a central London speech. Michael Crick has this report.
What were you doing in Afghanistan, Foreign Secretary?
What were you up to last night? Often an embarrassing question, especially when you've missed a big vote on Heathrow.
Will you resign over Heathrow, Mr Johnson?
Questions for Boris Johnson too today over reports he used a four-letter word to dismiss business concerns about Brexit.
Are you listening to business on Brexit?
Later, Theresa May pointedly said it was right to listen to business.
How are you? Lovely day, isn't it?
Then there's the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson. He's said to have threatened to break Theresa May if she doesn't give him a lot more money for defence.
Will you break the Prime Minister if she doesn't give you more cash?
Yet he was once Mrs May's campaign manager.
Will you break the Prime Minister?
Hardly a government of unity and harmony, as shown when Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood, hero of the Westminster Bridge attack, openly explained to MPs the stark divide between the MOD and the Treasury.
Failure to invest would lead to a demise in our capabilities at the very time that the world is getting more dangerous. I think we need to persuade the Treasury that the world is getting more dangerous.
And he said,
and I do believe that we can only achieve this if we see an increase in defence spending of at least 2.5%.
That would be a whopping £8 billion a year. But the Defence Committee today called for an extra £20 billion, from just over 2% of national income to 3%, backed even by Labour MPs on the committee.
Because of Brexit, the value of the pound has dropped. So the cost of a lot of the equipment which we're buying from the US has massively increased, which has left us with this 20 billion black hole. It depends whose figures you look at. So there's a huge black hole that we have to fill.
Did you make a macho demand for more cash, Mr Javid?
Sajid Javid has asked for more money for the police, since the $20 billion which Theresa May announced last week for health has sparked a ministerial bidding war, asking for money for other priorities, such as social care and housing. Outside the Imperial War Museum, what did the public think?
Which of those things there, here's the pen, you can mark, do you think the government should spend more money on?
I think she should cut it down, most probably split it between the go for health, defence, schools and social care. But don't give it all to one part.
Health, definitely schools, police, social care. I mean,
not housing.
Well, yes, housing as well.
But not defence.
No, I wouldn't particularly say defence. Yeah.
Now, how are you going to pay for that? Higher taxes, more borrowing or spending cuts elsewhere?
Probably a little bit of a combination, I would say.
Would you spend any money on those areas? Housing?
Yes. That's the big one.
Right.
And
health. And would you spend less money on some of them?
Defence.
Defence, right.
Probably less on defence,
Right.
and probably less on police and less on...
Less on police, right.
Yeah.
This evening, the Treasury Minister in charge of public spending turned up for a speech in which she was expected to be tough with her colleagues.
Now, what I'm speaking about tonight is how we can unlock growth in our economy, but also how we need to keep our public finances under control so we can keep our taxes as low as possible.
A lot milder than her Telegraph article today, where Liz Truss warned unconservative spending levels would mean higher taxes, which would in turn crush the party at the next election.
Michael Crick reporting from the House of Commons. I am joined now by the Conservative MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Bob Seeley, a former captain in the army deployed once to Iraq and 4 times to Afghanistan. Bob Seeley, how important is it to you that defence spending should be increased?
Personally, I think it is a no-brainer, but more importantly than just saying we need more money, we need to rebalance our foreign policy post-Brexit. I think our foreign policy has been too dominated by aid, and it probably needs to be more focused on hard power than soft power, and we need to focus more on trade because we need to make sure that we continue to have a growing economy so we can support the public services that those good people were talking about in Michael Crick's report.
How do you judge the mood amongst your Conservative MP colleagues?
I think there's a lot of support for defence spending, but then there is support for housing spending, which I would love to see. There's support for education, support for health. These are difficult decisions, and there is absolutely a debate going on in the party, and I welcome it. We're trying to remind ourselves, are we Conservatives, are we Liberals, are we free marketeers? To what extent do we want to use government powers to drive forward wealth creation, and how can we do that in a free market environment? So it's a very creative tension that's happening, and we should be embracing it and not being worried about it, because we're reinventing ourselves, and we're doing so while we're in government.
Well, as I mentioned, you've been at the sharp end of the sort of defence spending and guns and tanks and all the rest of it.
It was actually the other way around. I did a few in Iraq, but only one in Afghan. But thank you anyway, John.
But both, in a sense, were the sharp end, in a very big sense. Yeah. But there's the blunt end, which is two massive aircraft carriers, which seem to be completely useless, and also, of course, Trident, which is a very posh thing to have, but it's never going to be used.
It's never going to be used because it deters, and that's a really important thing. The one thing we have to remember is even when we win wars, they are cripplingly expensive. And that's winning them. That's not losing them, that's winning them. So actually the best way to avoid these crippling expenses of winning wars is to deter people so you never fight them. And that's why we need more hard power in the balance of foreign policy that we have. We also need to empower the Foreign Office far more. There are 5 government departments and a bunch of agencies that are all engaged in foreign affairs, and we need to coordinate more.
We are a small state, and we may even get smaller after Brexit. We are a small state. We may like to line up with China, Russia, and the United States, which is where we do with our defence spending. But we are a small island state. We're going to have let me make this point: that there we are with a relatively small state, and we are spending a huge amount on defence spending. And in fact, if you take Iraq and Afghanistan, that money was largely wasted. Those wars were totally unresolved, and no amount of military spending would ever reverse them.
I think you're right to question the Iraq and Afghan wars, and that's part of a broader conversation about were they worth it. When it comes to a small state, if you want to talk about a small state, Russia has an economy the size of Spain's. We are a much greater economy than Russia's. We are probably, in world terms, the second soft power nation on earth. We are one of the great nations. We're not a superpower. There are 2 superpowers, China and the United States, and against them we cannot compete, which is why our American alliance is very important. But we are a great nation and a great power, and I think it is wrong when we talk ourselves down, because we are one of those few global nations on earth, and it is important that we get a really active foreign policy that supports an ambitious goal, ambitious aims for this country post-Brexit.
In our report before we came to you, we spoke to just ordinary people on the street, and it's very hard to get them to understand in any way the priorities that you're discussing. And when they were asked, do you want to spend on defence spending, they were looking at housing, they were looking at the police, they were looking at all sorts of others, but they weren't looking at tanks.
You're absolutely right, and I think the simple answer to that is if you have a deterrence, you can have peace, and when you have peace, you can have prosperity. The first responsibility of government is to provide for the defence of the nation. Now, health is absolutely critical, education is critical, housing is critical, all these other things. I want a national park on the Isle of Wight, and I want a university, and they require funding and money. So I absolutely get the conflicting demands.
Right.
But first and foremost, we need to keep our nation safe, and we need a bit more hard power than we have at the moment, I would say.
Bob Seeley, thank you very much, and you even got your constituency demands for a university in. Well, everyone will have noticed that. Christian. Now, earlier I spoke to Labour's. Yes, unfortunately, the system does not support that particular camera. Let's go. I'm going to explain to you, actually, viewers, we have an auto cue, and unfortunately it failed on that particular camera. That's why I looked a little bonkers when you saw me just now. Now, earlier I spoke to Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, and started by asking her whether she had much sympathy for Boris Johnson and his stance on Heathrow.
I don't have a lot of sympathy with Boris Johnson. I think that he thinks he's unsackable and that he can say anything and do anything. And I think sometimes he behaves like a child that doesn't have any limits. And he has proved that Theresa May doesn't have the strength to get rid of him. So he just thinks that he can just carry on.
But on that single issue of Heathrow, I mean, the truth is Labour is divided too.
I think it's a divisive issue, and we had the honesty to accept that, and therefore we didn't have a whip on it. I mean, I voted against it because I believe in the future of the planet, and I think that we have to take our carbon emissions commitment seriously, and I don't think that we will be able to meet it if we have a third runway at Heathrow.
But then most Labour MPs voted in favour of it.
And that was a debate that we had within the party. We weren't able to win them over.
So why did Labour abstain on this Canada-EU treaty today?
Because the deal has already been done. Because Europe has already agreed it. We are leaving the European Union. But what we wanted to do was to put down some markers so that when we are in a customs union with the European Union, and we want to be able to be in a position to say, if you want to bolt on the fifth largest economy onto your deals, there will be certain things that we will want. And we were essentially putting down markers on that and explaining what it was that we had reservations about.
So this decision today is all about you believing that you do want the EU to continue negotiating treaties for us on our behalf.
With us. With us. So the EU will be negotiating treaties, and if they're going to do it with us, then we should have a seat at the table, and we should have some influence on future arrangements.
Well, that's obviously not compatible with Brexit, is it?
Well, it is compatible with Brexit, because what will happen is that we will leave. We will be in a customs union with them. If they're going to come up with a deal with another country, then if they want to have the extra welly that they will do by agreeing a deal that will include us, then we will expect to have a say.
Well, we won't have a say because we're not in the European Union. So it's going to be a question of them negotiating a treaty which we'll just have to live and lump.
No, we will be in a customs union, and part of that will be that if we want to negotiate as a bloc, as the EU plus Britain, then Britain will have a say in that as well. And
you think you've got a united party behind that?
Yes.
Completely?
I think so. Well, who knows? You may be able to pull out a backbencher who doesn't agree with that, but that's the approach that we're taking.
I still don't see where we negotiate on behalf of Britain and where the European Union negotiates on behalf of Britain. You seem to want it everywhere.
The European Union and Britain will be negotiating. So if we are in a position whereby we want to do a deal with a particular country, and so does the European Union, then we will be there. We will expect to have some say in those future arrangements, because we will be a sort of a bolt-on, a very large bolt-on, because we're such a large economy. But they will be negotiating with, we will be part of that negotiating team, and the deal will be for the EU plus Britain.
Brexit, Heathrow, spending, Trident. You are as badly split on all these issues as the government is. This country has never had such a split opposition, such a split government at one and the same time.
Well, I just don't agree with you. I think that there are certain differences that we have, and we're honest about those. But I think that what unites us is much more than divides us in the Labour Party, actually.
Emily Thornberry, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Now, a growing split over spending at the heart of government burst out into the open this evening, with Treasury Minister Liz Truss accusing fellow ministers of being unconservative for wanting extra public spending. After Jeremy Hunt secured extra money for the health service, the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson has apparently been asking for more too. Now, no one is naming names, but it's thought he is amongst those in Miss Truss's sights.
The public view of the military during peacetime may not extend far beyond the changing of the Guard and Poppy Day, but government ministers are now in open conflict about the need for more defence spending, one even admitting,
I think if we're honest and fair, it's got a little undignified.
Before taking aim at the enemy.
A failure to invest would lead to a demise in our capabilities at the very time that the world is getting more dangerous. I think we need to persuade the Treasury that the world is getting more dangerous.
Tonight, using quite extraordinary language, his Treasury colleague hit back.
It's not macho just to go out there and demand more money. The really tough skill is being able to take on the vested interests within your department, the blob, as I sometimes call them, and get better value for money.
Even so, national priorities have shifted. In the 50s, defence attracted double the level of spending that health received. Defence then got less as the NHS got more, and by the end of the Cold War they were neck and neck. But that trend continued, and now defence spending is just over 2% of GDP, whilst health spending heads towards 8%. And that was before the Prime Minister promised an extra £20 billion a year for the NHS. Now, of course, there are bids for all kinds of competing priorities. But enough Conservative MPs have defence at the top of their lists for the Prime Minister to want to take notice.
If it is possible for us to afford to spend an extra 20 billion on the National Health Service, which one welcomes, then it ought to be possible to find at least 1/10, 2 billion a year, so that we don't actually have to inflict further damaging cuts in defence.
The trouble is, equipment like these stealth fighters is getting ever more expensive.
Because of the drop in the value of the pound, the platforms that we're buying are now a lot more expensive. So we're ending up with a black hole in the defence budget. We have to cough up and pay up.
And there may be a price if we don't. As a reminder of that, HMS Montrose was tracking 2 Russian warships near the English Channel this week, where shipping lanes and undersea internet cables are thought to be vulnerable. Carl Didden, News at 10, Westminster.
The Chancellor's made no secret of his plan to raise taxes to pay for greater spending on the NHS. Now, as ministers come forward to ask for more money, this programme's learned that Philip Hammond has instructed the Treasury to rule nothing out as he looks for ways to pay for the NHS increase. Included in the list of potential tax rises are tweaks to the income tax thresholds, a slowdown in the rate at which corporation tax is cut, and an end to the exemption of national insurance contributions for over 65-year-olds. Now, the Chancellor wants his Cabinet colleagues to be under no illusions that whatever the tax is, the large hike is coming, and there's very little money left. This weekend, Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson, by way of a thinly veiled threat, became the latest one to jostle for pecuniary position. Today, a rap on the knuckles from Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liz Truss, telling warring ministers it was not macho to insist on more money for departmental budgets. Our political editor, Nick Watt, has the story and is here now. Nick, what are you actually learning about this tonight?
Well, so Philip Hammond is saying that substantial sums of money are going to have to be found to pay for that increase in NHS spending. And he doesn't want to use borrowing to do that. And he's very wary of using what's called fiscal headroom, which to you and me is spare cash in the Treasury. And he, as I understand it, he is saying that taxes are going to have to rise by around about 5 billion a year in the initial phase, and then towards the end of the 5-year programme, it'll have to be around about 10 billion a year in tax increases. And what the Chancellor is saying is that you can't really tinker around the edges, a little bit here and a little bit there. There is going to have to be one very big and politically painful tax rise. And he's saying, as you were saying there, that nothing is off the table. And that list you had there, I've been told those are the sorts of things they're looking at. Now, the reason why they're looking at all those possible tax rises is to show how incredibly difficult it would be. So, like tax thresholds, how would that fit in with the Tory manifesto for the last election? Ending national insurance exemptions for the over 65. How difficult would that be if you're trying to appeal to pensioners? And cutting corporation tax at a slower rate. How would that fit with that manifesto commitment? So it just shows how incredibly challenging it is.
Just on that one, is it your sense that these aren't necessarily ones that will happen, but he has to explain the difficulties that lie in front of anyone asking for money now?
He wants to say everything is on the table. So, for example, there was a pretty clear indication from Downing Street after the Prime Minister made the announcement that there'd be no increase in income tax, no increase in national insurance. As I understand it, the Chancellor is saying those are on the table. We're going to look at those. That's not going to happen, but we need to look at it. And the ones that you listed, that's examples of how very, very politically painful it would be to do all of that.
Just a quick word on what the Gavin Williamson position is in all this, because there was that sense at the weekend he was jostling for money in quite a threatening way.
There is a very strong belief in the Treasury that there was an operation by the Gavinson-William camp over the weekend, that various MPs were basically told to go out and say that they may struggle to support the government in the budget vote later this year. The view is that the numbers are not as high as it's being said, and that they really wouldn't carry out that, because that is really basically a vote of no confidence, not technically in the Prime Minister, but they are taking it seriously and they're not sort of completely writing off that potential source of trouble.
Well, thanks very much. So that's the theory, at least. Where's the money in practice? Our policy editor, Chris Cook, has been looking at the government books to see what can be afforded and at what cost.
Even the clichés are getting worn out. Belts have been tightened, the low-hanging fruit gone, and the fat trimmed. Further spending cuts are really hard right now. Increasing spending is now more likely to mean more tax or more borrowing. What to make then of a call to increase the amount of money we should spend on defence, a rise to 3% of GDP. That's what the Common Select Committee on Defence has proposed. During the 20th century, the amount that we spent on defence fell from around 7% of national output in the mid-1950s down to about 2% today. That doesn't mean that we kept cutting spending in real terms. What it means is that as our economy grew, we didn't keep reinvesting that growth back into defence, as defence became an ever lower spending priority. If we go back up to 3%, that would take us to levels we last saw in the mid-1990s. Just as a thought experiment then, how could we fund that? Well, to return to our clichés, the fat has pretty much gone. Cutting other areas of public spending to make room for defence is no longer much of an option.
For the last 8 years, the government has had quite a clear approach to getting the deficit down. They didn't want to see large tax rises, and instead what they've wanted to do is cut some areas of public spending to protect others, like health, education a bit, and to a lesser degree the defence budget. The problem they've got is because they've been cutting those other areas for 8 years, there's now much less fat in the system. So when they're looking to the future to protect those priorities, like health, possibly like the Ministry of Defence, they can't continue just to cut into these other areas. The FCO has already lost half its budget, it can't lose the other half.
Borrowing to fund defence is hard too. The Chancellor has a lot of headroom in his budget to borrow more without breaking his own fiscal rules. But the government pledged to increase NHS spending by £20 billion a year, more than uses it up. The Chancellor intends to raise taxes to cover some of that cost, and that's before there's any talk of more money for the forces.
Well, the Chancellor both can borrow a little bit more, and I think he probably will in the autumn, but he can't just borrow for all of the extra spending he wants to see, because his priority is to see debt falling year on year on year. Debt, the stock of borrowing we've done over time, he wants that falling, and that won't happen if he just borrows for all of these spending commitments.
If the Chancellor doesn't relent on borrowing, that means tax rises. Getting to 3% of GDP on defence would mean £20 billion more. For scale, that's 3 pence on the pound on both basic and higher rate income tax. A hefty tax rise.
What I've seen in the last 6 months is a real step change, with people really noticing things going wrong in public services and wanting change, and linking that with austerity and feeling that they do want to see an end to austerity, and that might mean higher taxes.
We do have room, economically speaking, to raise taxes if that's what we want to do. Britain raises a little less than the OECD average in tax take compared to the size of our economy. The Germans raise a little bit more, and the French much more than that. The critical thing to take away is you can raise a lot of taxes if that is what your politics demand. Will we get higher taxes then? Well, maybe, but pollsters' findings suggest the public might not buy higher taxes for defence.
Defence is really a low-level issue. It's something that people don't think about very much. It doesn't affect their day-to-day lives. It's quite low in their set of priorities. But it is also a volatile issue. Events can trigger it and move it up the list quite quickly. We haven't seen anything that's caused that to happen recently.
The much-discussed low-hanging fruit has all gone, the fiscal position's tight, we're ageing, and Russia is causing trouble. That's all building something that's not a cliché. Tory MPs who want higher spending backed by higher taxes.
Chris Cook there. Well, joining us now is Johnny Mercer. He's an up-and-rising star of the Conservative Party, the MP for Plymouth Moorview, and is a member of the Defence Select Committee. Thanks for coming in. Johnny, do you agree with Gavin Williamson's call for more defence spending?
I do agree with it, of course I do, but we have to be realistic about how we frame this debate. I think if we constantly look back, as we have done in those graphs, as to where defence spending was as a percentage of GDP, that is not overly helpful. If we look at what we're actually trying to do with defence, what does it mean as part of a multi-agency sort of operation around security and influence that we try and do as a country, if we frame it in that way, we can bring people with us and get people to understand you have to pay for a tier 1 military. But the trouble is, if we just endlessly talk about as a percentage of GDP or how much it's going to cost, then I worry we will start to undermine our efforts and actually not get to where we want to be.
So when you say pay for tier 1 military, the Chancellor's made no bones about what this will cost, and he's looking in extraordinary places to find that new money. You will put up, in your world, taxes to pay for military hardware?
Well, I think with the NHS and defence, it's slightly different. So I think in defence, there is still a long way to go on reform. And the military, I think, has for a long time managed areas, sort of empires within that department, and not really gripped the reform that has been needed to fundamentally change what being in the military means.
But reform is one thing, isn't it? And Gavin Williamson said in no uncertain terms, actually more money. We need to spend more money. So what I'm asking you is it worth, would you take to the nation the idea of having to pay more taxes for more defence?
I think the idea that you could go to the nation and pay more taxes for public services is one you could take forward. If you were only to go about defence, we have to be realistic. You go knocking on doors in Plymouth or London, then I'm afraid defence comes in at 9, 10 or 11 on people's priorities. And that is a result of, over the years, we haven't advocated for what defence is, what it's there for, why it's important, how it contributes to prosperity in communities like mine in Plymouth. And we're now sort of seeing the roots of that. We really are at such a crossroads now. If you think back to the creation of the RAF 100 years ago, people thought that was just a flash in the pan. We don't want to be looking in 10 years' time.
So how would you pay for it then? I mean, do you think it's just the wrong time to be asking for money for defence, or would you say you can't overborrow? So how is this? How do you square the Gavin Williamson circle?
I think you have to come forward, you have to give the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the British people confidence that that money you put into defence is going to significantly change what defence is, but also how people understand, so that people know what they're paying for.
But you know very well that on a list of choices, if people had to choose housing or health, they'd choose those over defence, right?
Of course, but you can't just sit back and say that's okay. You have to get out and advocate for what defence is about. Of course, you ask someone what the government is to anybody who lives in a street in this country, they'll talk to them about the hospital.
But you can't just make the case for it if you're talking about finding money. So where would that money come from? In practical terms, what would you take away from?
Well, we've just seen there that there is space for taxation. My party believes in lower taxation, and I absolutely agree with that. But I also think that this money has to come from somewhere. If you try and have the conversation with the British people about taxation, about paying for public services, for example, the NHS that is going up exponentially in the demand,
which of those taxes
they will come with you.
What do you think is the Chancellor's best bet at this point? Is it tweaking the sort of the tax bands? Is it an end to the exemptions of NIC contributions to the over 65s? These are the ones that were.
There are things that can be done in that respect. I mean, we talked about the winter fuel allowance at the last election. That didn't come through. Should wealthy pensioners get that? The other is the income thresholds. Yes. Well, you could go out and ask people if they were paying higher tax, whether or not they should be in receipt of winter fuel allowance, and quite a lot of pensioners will say they don't need that. If you look at the income tax thresholds, actually that benefits everybody, whether you're on £8,000 a year or £80,000 a year. Should there be a ceiling on that?
So you don't mind broadly being a party now that is brave enough to say we do need to ask people for more tax. We, the Conservatives, are going to be asking for more tax.
There's no point coming into politics with your sense of ideals and thinking this is what we believe in and we're going to put that on the British people and try and make it work. The British people they pay for us as politicians. So if the system isn't working, but if the system isn't working, it is their public services, it's their army, it's their NHS.
Yeah, but you're not going to have a referendum, are you? And there's not going to be an election. So what do you do now as a Conservative Party? Do you say, we have to tell you now that taxes will go up?
Yes, we have to have an honest conversation with the British people.
Conversation or tell you that taxes are going to go up?
We have to go and win that argument. And then if we go through that process and we get to the next election, we don't do very well, then we've got the answer. But I think, actually, if you're more honest with people and you say, actually, these services do cost more and people want to live in the Britain that's got the NHS and defence we've been talking about.
What do you make, though, of the way that this money has been jostled for, in the way that Gavin Williams has come out, in the way that Liz Truss has had to say, it's not macho to ask for money? I mean, you know, today in her speech, you had the Chief Secretary of the Treasury mocking the Environment Secretary, talking about Gove burning stoves or something. You had Greg Hands yesterday mocking Boris Johnson for being out the country for the Heathrow vote. And you've got everyone laughing at Private Pike, who's Gavin Williamson.
Look, you can, forever in politics, you can play this personality game. I absolutely get that.
Quite bad at the moment. It's a real breakdown in discipline, isn't it?
On the street, the people who pay for us as politicians, what they're concerned about is how we're going to answer those questions. And
Do you get embarrassed about cabinet colleagues talking about each other like this?
Look, in these situations, clearly, I think they are serious questions for serious people to make serious contributions to the conversation. And my concern is if we get wrapped around the axles of these personality politics, we are going to miss that point and undermine, you know, really, really important questions that we have to answer in this country today.
Johnny Mercer, thank you. Thanks for coming in.
I've been